The next time you sit down for a meal, I'd like you to take a moment to think about two things. One is that agriculture accounts for 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Over the coming decade, we need to increase our food production by 50%, which means that that number is only going to increase. Second, I want you to reflect on the fact that there's 500 million small-scale producers around the world who rely on agriculture for their livelihood. Climate change means that their livelihoods are at risk. Now, that's obviously a depressing thought by which to start a meal. But there is good news. Today, I'm here to tell you a little bit about some of the work Digital Green is doing to help smallholder farmers become aware of and adopt climate-smart agricultural practices, and ultimately help them increase their yield and their income as a result of doing so. Food is fundamental. I joined Digital Green about a year and a half ago after professional experience in areas like technology entrepreneurship and investing. I was drawn to Digital Green because it works with smallholder farmers in particular, who are most vulnerable and at risk when it comes to our food production systems. Food's also a really interesting canvas through which to understand some of the political and economic inequities in our system. About 10 cents of every dollar that's spent on food actually makes its way to the primary producer. As we think about the impact climate change is having on our world, its intersection with food is one that I think is particularly important for all of us to be aware of, and one that I'm excited that we're working on at Digital Green. The good news is that there are climate-smart agricultural practices that deliver win-win outcomes. These are win-win practices because they deliver benefits across a range of factors. One is on the environmental side. These practices reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They also improve biodiversity. They optimize water usage and limit the runoff of chemicals into our water supply. And they're also good for soil health. From a livelihood and income perspective, these are practices that can increase resilience of farmers, which means that when climate change results in changes in weather patterns, farmers' yields are not as badly impacted. These also increase income as a result of reducing the amount of money that farmers need to spend on inputs. Finally, a lot of the farmers who adapt these practices, who actually implement them, are women, which means that elevating their importance supports gender equity. So it's great that all these practices exist and there's good research to suggest that they have win-win potential. But the reality is that that's not how farming is happening in most of the world today, especially among smallholder farmers in the countries where Digital Green works, places like India, Ethiopia, Kenya, Indonesia. Here, again, there's hundreds of millions of small-scale producers that are following practices that are not optimized for these things. So the question is, what can we do about it? That we need a multi-stakeholder approach that engages people across the entire agricultural ecosystem to make a change. Again, the good news here is that there's an awareness and a recognition and lots of incentives in place for people to change how they think about food production. On the market side, you have customers like you and I who are demanding more transparency into how our food is grown. And that transparency is something that agribusinesses will pick up and respond to. Agribusinesses also are making pretty large commitments in terms of meeting net zero emission targets, which is a big deal because it's something that they've committed to their boards, to their investors, and they need to demonstrate progress. They're also finding that the cost of capital for companies that are able to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions are coming down through instruments like sustainability-linked finance and green bonds. On the policy side, you're also seeing an awareness and a recognition that climate-smart agriculture does a nice job of bringing together two important considerations, one being sustainable development and livelihood creation, and the other being reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Seeing the link between these two, there's exciting policy initiatives like evolving the public distribution systems or the food welfare programs that exist in many countries. As a result of some of these changes that are happening, we think that it's critical for there to be one additional piece of the puzzle that really engages with small-scale producers. We believe that the missing piece of the puzzle that can convert all this interest and talk and excitement into action is a combination of things that really engage smallholder farmers. And we're launching a program in Bihar, India that brings these pieces together. One is we need to coach farmers and make them aware about climate-smart agricultural practices that are relevant for their specific context. Second, we need to develop a way for farmers to make credible claims about what practices they're following and what the environmental impacts of those practices are. Finally, we need to put farmers in a position where they can benefit from this data and information, a data wallet that puts them in control of all the production practices they're following and links them with stakeholders who value those things. One of the things that we've learned at Digital Green over many years of working with smallholder farmers is that people are most receptive to information when it's delivered by trusted individuals who are part of the community and is very tailored and relevant for their own individual circumstance. One of the things that we've worked to develop over the past years in partnership with our government partners is what we call our community video-enabled extension model. In that model, we build the capacity of our government partners who are already in the communities providing extension services to change the way they do those production advisories, to integrate video and to have a very rigorous method of collecting data from farmers about what's working, what's not working, and feed that back in to improving the production and delivery of those practices. Very practically, what happens is that local community members produce videos that demonstrate production practices. Those videos are screened in small, intimate community settings where farmers are free to ask questions, where there's follow-up every 2 weeks, and farmers are able to share their own experience about whether they adopted the practices, what did or didn't work about it. And that sort of participatory approach with lots of peer knowledge sharing has been one that's proven to be effective. We've seen a 40% increase in adoption rates of production practices as a result of this sort of approach. Also, it's cheaper than some of the traditional extension approaches which rely on demonstration plots in farmer field schools. We've estimated that the cost of adoption through such a community video-enabled model is about $3 per adoption versus 24, or an 8 times cost saving versus the traditional approach. One of the things we're keen to do as we think about adopting climate-smart agriculture in these contexts is to ensure that the advisories that are coming through to farmers are backed by rigorous scientific evidence and are really focused on delivering that win-win proposition of increasing income, reducing some of the climate challenges associated with agricultural production, and increasing farmer resilience. We're especially proud of the fact that a lot of our work happens through women's farmer groups, which means that our engagement reaches a majority of women farmers. It's also critical that we work with government extension providers that have trust and reach in the communities we work with. In the case of Bihar, which is where we're launching this program, our partner, Jivika, reaches about 6 million rural households. Working through an existing structure means that we have immediate scale and that we're building on the trust that these organizations have within the community. One of the things that we'll be doing as part of our program is really ensuring that local knowledge and context is able to be collected and shared and used in a feedback loop to tailor advisories for farmers. What we can do is enable the frontline extension workers, or in the case of Jivika, the VRPs or village resource persons, to have technology at their fingertips that based on just a few input parameters could help them advise farmers on exactly how to optimize for their local conditions. That sort of local approach will help build trust and ensure that what's delivered is technically sound and appropriate for that local context. That's one part of the story. We need to raise awareness and coach farmers on what practices are critical for them. Next, we need to have a solution and a mechanism by which we can record data about what is actually happening on the ground and quantify that. In order to make credible claims about emission reductions, there's 2 critical inputs. One is we need to know what practices farmers are following. And the second is we need a mechanism to take that data about practices and convert it into accurate estimates of emissions and other important environmental indicators. On the first piece, the good news is that the village resource persons I described earlier already maintain manual VRP registers of what practices farmers are following. There's an opportunity to streamline that by digitizing the process. Second, it's critical to establish a rigorous methodology for how the data is verified. This includes random audits and samples and being really transparent about what data was collected when to engender trust and credibility for what information we're gathering. Finally, there's a really interesting opportunity for technology to help drive down the cost and increase the accuracy of such data and the verification that goes into it. The reality today is that the cost for a lot of these programs is a little bit out of reach, especially for smallholder farmers. But as those costs come down, we'll find ways to integrate them into our programs. Once we have this data about what production practices farmers are following, and it's logged in a way that's trustworthy and credible to external stakeholders, we can generate emissions estimates. And so the question is, how does this data ultimately benefit farmers? What's in it for them? And that's where the data wallet comes in. Think of the data wallet as a virtual repository of critical information about a farmer. Where's their land? How large is it? What are they growing? What's their yield? What production practices are they following? This information is obviously important for farmers themselves. They can use it to track their performance year over year and look at things like, what was my yield? What sort of inputs did I use? What income did I have from growing different crops? There's also a lot of value in being able to share this data in a way that preserves farmers' agency and gives them control over who sees what information. We talked earlier about some of the changes that are happening in terms of food traceability and transparency in supply chains. To participate in those sorts of supply chains, which can often be more premium in terms of pricing that comes back to farmer, credible and trustworthy record of what practices have been followed is critical. And that's what the virtual data repository is providing farmers. A bunch of data that they've generated and owned that's been verified by the government extension system that they can share with such providers. Finally, there's a lot of momentum and excitement around payment for ecosystem services and carbon offset markets. It's yet to be seen where such markets will develop in the coming years. But again, a rigorous record of what practices farmers are following and quantification of exactly how that translates to environmental outcomes like greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity is a necessary prerequisite for farmers to engage in such opportunities. So the data wallet gives farmers a way to take agency and control over the data about what they're doing, where they're doing it, how it's impacting their yield to improve their own decision making, but also unlock external opportunities. We're excited to launch this program, which will enable smallholder producers to adopt more sustainable, climate-smart agricultural practices, make claims about the agricultural practices that they're following through the MRV platform, and then ultimately be in position to take advantage of these for their own benefit through the data wallet. One of the great joys about my time at Digital Green is that it's opened my eyes to our food system. And I invite you all to join me in that journey in your own lives. When I talked about the opportunities for farmers to benefit from climate-smart agricultural practices, it involves action from us as consumers to demand that change from the food retailers we frequent, from the farmers markets we visit, from the types of products that we buy. So let's collectively play our role in making the changes on the demand side that'll support the adoption of such programs and practices that will reduce emissions, increase farmer livelihood, and ultimately ensure that we have a sustainable future, one where we all can enjoy nutritious and safe food, and one where the people who produce it can enjoy an equitable and just livelihood. Thank you.